Travel is somewhat of a rite of passage for so many people across the world, but have you ever stopped to consider the impact that your travel could have on the planet? Or maybe you want to know how you can reduce your environmental footprint while traveling. So I'm currently in the process of booking an overseas trip, and as a full-time sustainability professional, I came to wonder whether my plan was really sustainable. Recently, I've been hearing a lot of horror stories about tourism gone wrong, with everything from destruction of culturally significant sites to people risking their lives for a perfectly Instagrammable shot. So in this video, I want to go through some of the most problematic trends in travel culture right now, and we'll look at 10 different strategies to ensure that your upcoming trip is as sustainable as it is enjoyable. So the first major problem that I want to talk about is over-tourism. So over-tourism is this idea that there's just too many people traveling to a specific location. This can have impacts such as long-term and short-term degradation of the environment and the local culture. Over-tourism has seen a massive uptick in recent years, and this is largely because of the role of travel influencers and the internet in promoting these places. Oftentimes what will happen is people will post a really nice aesthetic shot on Instagram, but the problem is that a lot of the time these places don't necessarily have the capacity or the infrastructure to be able to handle that many people. And so what happens is that over time is that environment starts to degrade. Uluru is a great example of this in Australia. Basically, before its closure in 2019, hundreds of thousands of people per year would come to climb the Big Red Rock. However, over time, this led to severe environmental and socio-cultural consequences for the area. For example, one driver of the environmental damage was the lack of facilities at the top of the climb. For the Anangu people, who are the traditional owners of the land as well, the climbing of Uluru had significant cultural and spiritual impacts as well. This is because Uluru was this intensely spiritual site and had been home to ceremonies and traditions for tens of thousands of years. So it was such a welcome development when finally parks decided to close the Uluru climbing track permanently. Similarly, in places like Bali, which for us Australians is quite a common holiday destination, you have hundreds of tons of plastic waste washing up on the beaches every single day. And being a relatively underdeveloped country compared to places like Australia, they just don't have the waste infrastructure and systems to be able to manage that much waste. And the impacts go further than environmental impacts as well. For urban areas in particular, there is something called the Airbnb effect, which you might very well be familiar with. This is because it's quite common to get this influx of tourists, which translates to an increase in short-term rental availability and a decrease in long-term rentals, which pushes out local residents and small businesses and raises the cost of living in a region. If you've ever been to places like Dubrovnik in Croatia or Venice in Italy, you'll probably know what I mean by this. So how do you avoid having this negative environmental and social impact, and what can you do to reduce your environmental footprint? These are my top 10 strategies for sustainable travel. Now to start off with transport, so transport emissions make up around half of all emissions from tourism, so it makes sense to start here. So the main thing to remember here is to always choose sustainable transport options where possible. One of the ways you can do this is to minimize flying. So as you might know, flying and aviation is probably one of the most emissions intensive ways of getting around, but in a lot of cases you can't necessarily avoid it. So what I would recommend if you do have to fly somewhere is to try to choose direct flights wherever possible, because that avoids some of the additional emissions caused by the takeoff and landing components of the flight. And if flying somewhere is your only option, you can often choose to offset the carbon emissions from that flight using carbon credits. Now, I know that offsets are somewhat controversial, but as someone that works in the industry and advises companies on when they should and shouldn't buy carbon offsets, I'm here to tell you that they're not all bad, as long as they're only being used to offset hard to abate emissions and that they aren't used to justify additional emissions being generated. If it helps, I generally tend to offset my emissions from flights, but that decision is totally up to you as well. On the topic of transport, you should also try to avoid cruises wherever possible. This is because cruise ships can generate up to 4 times as many emissions as planes, and they also tend to generate a lot more waste. Next, consider the destination where you are traveling. It's always good to do some thorough research on your destination before you go to identify whether that place is already over-touristed and to find out if it has any green credentials like being eco-destination certified or having a green tick. Generally speaking, if you find a place on an Instagram reel with thousands or millions of views, then it's probably safe to assume that that place is gonna be busy. So feel free to use travel influencers as inspiration, but remember that the places that they're promoting aren't often as pristine and uninhabited as they might appear. If you've ever seen those videos that are like Instagram versus reality of common tourist places, then you'll know exactly what I mean. I think a good way of checking whether a place has capacity for the amount of tourists that go there is whether it has a cap or a limit on the amount of people that can go to a certain area within a certain time frame. One example of a place that does this well is the West Coast Trail in Canada, which is part of the Pacific Rim National Park. With this trail, you have to book in advance and you pay for a spot on the walk. That fee then goes towards trail maintenance, as well as this really cool training program that they have at the beginning of the trip. The training goes for, I think, an hour or two from memory, but it teaches you all the things that you need to know about how to respect the environment and the land while you're there, as well as things to watch out for like bears and wolves and stuff. But the point is that they have a limit on the amount of people that can go there in a certain time frame, which ensures that it doesn't get over trampled and that the wilderness doesn't get unnecessarily impacted. I think the fact that there are still bears and wolves and stuff around there is an indication of how well it has been maintained. And lastly, it's to stay in places longer to try and minimize travel, as well as giving yourself the time to be able to properly immerse yourself in the environment. I've definitely done both styles of traveling. I went on a big bus tour around Europe when I was 18, and I think we traveled through maybe 1 or 2 countries every 2 days, which was absolutely exhausting. I think I would definitely recommend staying in places for longer periods of time, both from an environmental perspective, but also for the enjoyment aspect as well. And the third area to consider when planning your sustainable trip is the activities that you plan on doing. And the activities that you plan while you're doing there can have a really big impact on the amount of benefits that the local community gets from you traveling there, which should be part of the aim if we're wanting to ensure that these places remain good places to visit over the long term. Because not supporting local businesses in an area leads to what I spoke about earlier, which is that sort of Airbnb effect in big cities. So some of the ways that you can support local businesses in the countries where you travel include using local travel guides for either traveling out into the wilderness, going on hikes and climbs and that sort of thing, or for cultural explorations throughout the cities that you visit as well. As well as this, aiming to buy souvenirs from smaller family-owned businesses rather than those big conglomerate souvenir shops that you see in literally every country while you're traveling is a really great way to support local artists and small businesses. On this as well, it's super important to respect local cultures where you're traveling. So if you're traveling to cultures that have maybe different cultural expressions or traditions, it is important to be respectful of those as well, so you're not unnecessarily impeding on people's daily life. And if you're going to be traveling to any wilderness areas, try to stick to the path as much as possible and always avoid trampling on habitat and plants and vegetation. This will ensure that biodiversity is conserved, and it will also make sure that the park stays pristine and like wilderness for future travelers. For more sustainability content, hit that subscribe button and I will see you in the next video.